the breaking of ties where a certain relationship is established, often quite a relationship with a connection, to use that language. This also seems to be one of the parallels between these two cases. Now, we might say that, according to Krakauer's account, what we see with McCandless is a series of relationships that are established on the road. And Krakauer does a nice job, I think, of saying that some of these relationships seem that in some respects, McCandless seemed quite a gregarious person, that people had connections with him, that he was quite likable. So this is one of those moments where we might say that there's a difference, that there's something that is not a parallel, and maybe that one could critique my sense of some parallels here. But let's think about how this is posed, this idea is posed by John Krakauer. And of course, if you've seen the film, you may remember that there's a number of people that, in a way, you could say that part of Into the Wild is a road movie where McCandless does have some, what seem to be quite intense, even if short-lived relationships. So this is what Krakauer says. He says, McCandless did forge a number of significant, if short-lived, relationships. And here's Krakauer's direct quote. He says that Chris was, and I quote him, outgoing and extremely personable when the spirit moved him. He charmed a lot of folks. He could be generous and caring to a fault. That's a nice character description, and it seems maybe not to fit with this. But maybe what is crucial is we could argue that the very condition of possibility for these short-lived, somewhat intense connections that McCandless has is the very condition of possibility for them is that he knows that they're not going to last, that he's going to move away from them. So one of the most memorable sequences in the film, which is also told in Into the Wild, is when Chris McCandless has done a couple of jobs. He forms a bit of a relationship to, I think the guy's name's Wayne Westerberg, a guy who does crop work. I think it's in the Dakotas. He also has a relationship with two so-called rubber tramps, people who move from one place to another but are essentially in a way homeless. Jan Burez, I think is the woman's name, who he has a relationship with. But in each of these cases, the relationship seems to be crucially qualified by it being broken off. And that seems to make it possible for McCandless. So the sequence in the film that I was referring to is one where an old, somewhat disconsolate man who's lost his family, as it were, takes McCandless in for a while. And McCandless is there for, I forget if it's a few weeks, does some leather work, and they seem to have a kind of relationship. And I'm just going to quote directly from my account of it in this paper. Ron France is a rudderless and disconsolate old man who's lost his family under tragic circumstances. He befriends McCandless and subsequently offers to adopt him. Now, if my hypothesis is correct, that in both of these cases we have a virtually anxious, phobic reaction to the ongoing establishment of symbolic fixity, a family bond, all of those things, then one can appreciate how that offer is not going to be particularly well received by McCandless. You could argue then that unknown to Ron France, who really takes to Christopher McCandless, that he has it's a surefire way of pushing McCandless away to ask him, can I adopt you? Having escaped constraints of family and a father figure in particular, it seems unlikely that, to put it mildly, McCandless would wish to reassume such ties. Let's do a quote from Krakauer, and as so many times is the case, we find in Krakauer a very articulate, I think, account which chimes with some of the conceptualization I'm trying to develop here. After he receives this offer from Ron France, McCandless sets off on his great Alaskan adventure. I think he fobs off France by saying, well, I'll consider it when I get back. But this is how Krakauer describes it. McCandless was thrilled to be on his way, and he was relieved as well. Relieved that he had again evaded the impending threat of human intimacy, of friendship, and all the messy emotional baggage that comes with it. He had fled the claustrophobic confines of his family he'd successfully kept Jan Burez and Wayne Westerberg, those were friends that he met on the road, at arm's length, flitting out of their lives before anything was expected of him. And now he slipped painlessly out of Ron France's life as well. So those are Krakauer's words, but they fit, I think, very nicely what I'm trying to argue here. Now we need to consider one possible example where the account I'm building may seem not to hold. And I think it's important to bear those points in mind, and there will be presumably differences here. But one of those kind of signal moments is that there is a point when Christopher McCandless does involve himself in a kind of gift giving. Now we've already said that giving a gift is much different from receiving a gift, so that helps us. But there is a moment when Christopher McCandless does give a gift, and it's in the film and it's also in Krakauer's account, and he gives his friend Wayne Westerberg, a guy who ran a custom combine crew that McCandless had worked with in South Dakota, he gives him a very treasured gift. And here's the quote from how Krakauer describes it. McCandless gave Westerberg a treasured 1942 edition of Tolstoy's War and Peace. On the title page, he inscribed, "Transferred to Wayne Westerberg from Alexander, October 1990. Now, I find that so fascinating. You may recall that when I spoke about how, and I read McCandless's words when he spoke about, I'm going to divorce my parents. Initially, that may sound like an odd, he didn't say I'm going to leave them behind, he said I'm going to divorce them. So there's a kind of legalistic language, almost a kind of formal quality to that language. And we see it again here. He doesn't just write on the book, to my buddy Wayne, you're a great guy. He says, transferred to Wayne Westerberg from Alexander. Again, this kind of formal legal type of language. So what can we make of that? This is the account I give in the paper. McCandless quite emphatically marks that symbolic transaction. This is clearly not the case of a spontaneously given gift. It resembles rather a quasi-legal exchange process. After all, he uses the word transferred. It is as if, for McCandless, the exchange of gift-giving brings with it an inherent risk, an inherent vulnerability. And that as such, the process needs to be formalized, the symbolic transfer logged in the protective fashion of a legal contract. So in other words, you could say that there are moments when, and admittedly, it's giving a gift rather than receiving a gift, but there are moments when he does that, but it's almost as if he needs to couch it in the symbolic terms to make what is inherently a more anxiety-provoking or difficult process a little bit more manageable. This is how I put it in the paper. If one has a solid grounding in the symbolic, then such transactions are commonplace phenomena that remain unburdened with weighty meaning or noxious emotional significance. But if, however, one's position in the symbolic is somewhat more tenuous, then it stands to reason that one might wish to underline the symbolic transaction in a definitive matter, so as to anchor the gesture, to stabilize it, locking it thus into a set of clearly defined terms. It's almost as if they need to be overstated, because you could argue that perhaps McCandless isn't adequately or is trying to avoid being located in, or finds being located in definitive symbolic terms quite inhibiting and not something, as it were, that comes naturally. Okay, so we have now managed to introduce a series of parallels between these two cases. We've also, I think, tried to keep in mind that there may be some differences, that this might be a flawed series of quasi-equations. That's fine. We'll come back to one or two more observations about McCandless. We'll cite him a few more times, and some of those differences might become clear. But let's now circle back to some of what Grigg has said to us. And of course, as you'll remember, the overarching agenda in these talks is to think about what different Lacanian conceptual coordinates can provide us, what different avenues, perspectives on melancholia. Now, we remember that the crucial difference that Russell Grigg brings about is to say that it's the presence, a kind of overbearing, toxic presence of too muchness of an object, rather than merely the loss of an object that matters. Now, the more we reflect upon that, the more it seems that we need to qualify, what does he mean by this overproximate, burning, toxic, traumatic object? What kind of object does he mean? Now, that seems important to qualify, because My overarching argument would be to say that while I take a lot from Russell Grigg's approach, I think Russell Grigg's argument is quite keen on saying Freud's model of melancholia doesn't do a good enough job, this one is better. My own approach would be to say that maybe Freud's account of the loss of the lost and also hated object fits with this. Or differently put, you could say there are different layers, different conceptual explanations or approaches to the same phenomena. Or put differently again, Grigg wants to say, from one vantage point, it's actually the excess presence of an object, a real object in Lacanian terminology, that is the most important phenomena at hand. And he's saying that in contrast to Freud, who's saying that the most focal process here is the loss of a given object. So could we reconcile these two? Well, one way of attempting to try to reconcile that is to say that Lacanian theory is always going to be aware of how a loss of an object and the overbearing presence and proximity of an object can be co-present. It's just a question of what level of object are we thinking about. So the toxic, overly present, burning, traumatic, intrusive object in Russell Grigg's account should be qualified as real. It's an object of jouissance, it's an object of anxiety, which comes too close. We could then, by contrast, say that the lost object for Freud is more an object, maybe we could call it an imaginary stroke symbolic object. It's an object which has provided an imaginary support, a relationship, a sense of love, a sense of recognition for the subject. And if we make that qualification, we could say that we are looking at the same phenomena whereby the loss of a loved object, which locates me as an identity, which locates me as an ego, that loss might be the same, oddly enough, paradoxically, as the overpresence of something traumatic. And I think that's one hopeful gesture here to try and reconcile these two different approaches. So let us give one brief quote from Grigg, and then we'll try to draw to a conclusion and then move on to highlighting some elements of death drive in these cases. So the distinction I've just tried to make is to say that we need to bear in mind, in thinking of Freud's account on one hand and Grigg's account on the other, the difference between ego-sustaining objects, in which I think is what the loss of an object in Freud's account refers to. Those are objects which provide a kind of fantasy covering. They provide a certain degree of stability on the one hand. And on the other hand, the real object. And the real object in Russell Grigg's account is a kind of object that doesn't have a protective screen. It's an object that's difficult to mediate. It's an object that brings with it an intrusive, overbearing jouissance, an intrusive, overbearing toxicity, you could say. This object, for Grigg, is not simply an object cause of desire. It is an unmediated traumatic object, an excessive thing that irradiates the subject with a type of inflammatory jouissance. We'll say one more thing before rounding up. What Grigg goes on to do in thinking about melancholia is he links it to a series of other conditions, other, I suppose we could say, diagnostic categories, and he wants to say, well, isn't it interesting to consider that in melancholia, the underlying project in a way, or the underlying problem, is that the subject hasn't fully separated from this traumatic object, this overbearing object. The proximity of the object here means that the subject has not separated themselves off from this real object. This plenitude of jouissance, he says, and I'm quoting him from his chapter in Lacanian in Madness. This is a quote from page 154. In the absence of this ability to separate from an object, we have a plenitude of jouissance. And this plenitude, we could say excess, overflow of jouissance, anxious jouissance, the real, is apparent in such typical formations as erotomania and persecutions characteristic of paranoia. So whether we think of erotomania, where there's a great deal of loving libidinal investment in another who becomes of focal importance to the subject, or in paranoia, we both see a kind of over-accentuation of jouissance in an object. In Melancholia, I'm quoting Grigg, we encounter the same failure of separation from the object. The depressive function is explained by the fact that the unseparated off object, in being a piece of the real, leaves the subject exposed and defenseless to its ravages. Leaves the subject exposed and defenseless to its ravages. So let's conclude then by saying, in Grigg's account, Melancholia should be understood not simply along the lines of a lost unconscious object, but rather in terms of difficulties being definitively located or fixed. We could say also that now maybe we've got three different lines of approach. Freud's account of melancholia, the lost object which cannot be mourned, the lost object which is also hated and internalized, so whereby the aggressive enactments of conflict and on that lost, hated object are being enacted on the ego itself with a kind of super egoic ferocity. That's Freud's account. Then we've got the account that I've tried to mount, which is all about symbolic fixity, about the difficulties of locating oneself, about the terror of closeness, about the overbearing anxiety that comes with too much proximity to others. And then we've got Russell Grigg's account about the overbearing presence of a toxic object. And of course, what we're building to is to say that in each of these cases, we could say that we're approaching the same phenomena from different conceptual coordinates. It's almost as if what we're saying is that we're using different theories. I'm approaching these issues of symbolic fixity, uprootings, anonymity, so on and so forth, from earlier periods in Lacan's work, where it's all about the symbolic, it's about how one is located in the symbolic, whereas Grigg is approaching some of these ideas from much later Lacan, where the notion of the real and the object of the real is much more important. But what I'm trying to suggest is these are very potentially flip sides of the same coin, that they're different conceptual coordinates for approaching the same phenomena. Let's stop there.